We'll be starting right on time and getting our chat rolling and going. Again, if you're just coming in, please put in your name, your personal pronouns, as well as where you're situated in the state of Missouri or in somewhere else. We may have some folks outside of Missouri. All right, you all, it's 9:05. Let's get started. I'm so happy to be with everyone. We're great. We're so thankful at Alive and Well that you decided to join us this morning for our learning community. And so my name is Cecilia Belser-Patton. My pronouns are the She AI series, and I am the Director of Leadership Development and School Activation for Alive and Well Communities. I'm based here in Kansas City, Missouri. And so I am here with Jermaine Alberti, who is our Interim Deputy Executive Director for the Kansas City area. Also, Micah Chrisman, who is our Director of Communications, and Dan Breeding, who is one of our program managers with Alive and Well. There's some more folks. I think Polly Rios is with us as well. Polly is the co-director for community activation with our organization. And so we're really thankful that you all decided to be with us this morning as we talk about this important topic and what we hope is an interesting topic for you. So the title of our facilitation this morning is The Cultural Competencies of REDI plus A/B. REDI stands for Race, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, plus accessibility and belonging. And we're looking at this through the lens of trauma-informed practices and looking at this as a restorative practice. So restoring us back to our humanity, restoring us back to being in community with one another, in collective with one another, and situating and centering relationships. So again, my name is Cecilia Belser-Patton. I'm the Director of Leadership Development with Alive and Well Communities and School Activation as well. And we're very grateful to have you here with us this morning. One of the things as we go to the next slide that I always do is bring in my people who brought me here, literatively and figuratively, to this type of work. And that is my grandmother and my mother, who were some of the most profound educators I've ever known. And my granny used to say, my abuela said, start as you mean to go on, meaning don't start stuff you're not going to be able to finish. And so what I like to do in coming into community with one another is making sure that we start as how we like to finish. And so I always want to start in community. I always want to start with you in mind as our guest, as our collective, as we're going through this facilitation. And so we want to hear your voices. And so we want to remind you that the chat is a communication tool. It's a way in which we can communicate with one another. We can put in our ahas. We can say, whoa, this is a thought that I had. So as you just put in your name and where you're located here in the state of Missouri, and your pronouns, if you so chose, I'd like you to put in a one-word feeling word, a word of how you're feeling this morning. And remember that no word is a good or bad word. It's just a word that is showing how we're feeling this morning. So my word that I would put in is excited. I'm excited to be here with everyone and to be in community with everyone. So I next want to get us started with ways in which we can be in community with one another starting as we mean to go on by centering a restorative practice of mindfulness and a restorative practice of how we choose to be with one another in community with our breath. And so I'd like to take us through a round of box breathing is what I call it, with a 4-quarter breathing, with our quarter breathing. So we'll be breathing in for 4 counts through our nose. We'll be holding that for 4 counts, and then we'll be breathing out for 4 counts. And when we're breathing in all that we want from this facilitation, all that we want to bring, curiosity, joy, peace, understanding, connective, community. And we're going to hold that in our whole process for 4 counts. And then we're going to breathe out anything that might interrupt that. Frustration, anxiety, fear, anything, right? And so that is what we're going to do together as a restorative practice that we will help center us in our community this morning. So I'll count us down from 3, 2, 1, and then we'll breathe in through our nose. 2, 3, 4. We'll hold that for 4 counts. And then we'll breathe out through our mouths. 2, 3, 4. Does everyone have it? So I'll count us, give a thumbs up if you do. If you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat or jump off the microphone and share. Okay, so I'll count us back from 3, 2, 1, and then we're going to breathe in through our nose. 2, 3, 4, hold. 2, 3, 4, and out through our mouths. 2, 3, 4. In. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4, and out through our mouths. 2, 3, 4. We're breathing in everything we need for this facilitation. Holding that. And now breathing out. And our last time of breathing in. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Now breathe out for as long as you can. And just to hold that center of calm and come back to community whenever you're ready. This is a restorative practice of mindfulness and breathing and being in community with one another. So you can populate the chat with how your body's feeling now that you've had that intentional breathing this morning. Maybe a little bit more calm, maybe relaxed, ready, whatever it may be. All right, as we go to the next slide, we're going to center seeing one another, being present with one another, listening to one another, being in community with one another. And so we really encourage us at Alive and Well to actively try to see one another and to see from another point of view, another perspective, to be in community with one another. And in doing so, we actually allow ourselves to be seen. So we encourage us being authentically ourselves, to being present, to sharing who we are, getting comfortable with being vulnerable, getting comfortable with ourselves as open and honest and authentic as we can be. This is important because in our next slide, we're going to be encouraging one another to speak boldly about our gifts as we go into our breakout rooms in just a minute, our first breakout. We're going to go into breakout with one another in community before we get started to just share who we are. So we'll know who we are when we're in this space together. So we'll have about 3 or 4 of us in the breakout room for about 3 to 4 minutes. We're going to share our name. We're going to share who we are, what we do, and we're going to share what brought us to this training through this facilitation. Because we think it's important, again, to start as we mean to go on, as my Mima said, to make sure that we're centering ourselves and to make sure that we're centering community. So Micah is going to break us out into breakout rooms. Don't worry about the time. We will bring you back in. And so enjoy one another, get to know one another, get to know who you're in community with here in Kansas City, St. Louis, and across the state. All right, Micah.
You got damn glasses on.
Sorry, y'all, I have to fix this. Let me sorry, everybody. Gotta actually create more than one breakout room. So let me get that fixed.
Hey, Micah.
Yeah.
There were 27 people in our breakout room.
Yeah, unfortunately, I needed to click. I was sharing my screen and it set up only one breakout room, so I apologize.
Gotcha. I was like, oh no, did I do this wrong?
Nope. I just need to make let's see, we got about 40.
Good morning, Becca.
Hey, Cecilia.
I will get this better assigned here.
Cool.
Okay. Almost there, y'all. Thanks for your patience. Okay, let's try this.
Bruce, Cheyenne, and Monty, did you all not get a breakout room? Good morning, Tracy and Dewana. We're going into, and Roxanne, we're going into breakout rooms with our community members for just about 3 minutes. So we will send you over to a breakout room so that you can introduce yourself to our community. Hi, how are you, Tracy? Micah, can we put Cheyenne in a breakout room as well?
I think she's already assigned. The folks who just joined in, I had to assign them, but there we go.
Thank you. Hi, Kimberly. We're getting ready to come right out of breakout rooms. So if you can just hang tight with us. Micah, if we can start bringing people back.
Okay, thank you. Sorry,
No
I'm
problem.
late.
No need to apologize. It is a Wednesday morning, so anything could and may go as they go. That's what I'm recognizing in the world.
So I'm gonna go ahead and close them out.
Please.
Okay, 60 seconds.
Thanks, Micah.
Mike, I was in a trauma awareness training the other day and we did some breakout rooms and I noticed bad internet connections. People would lose their internet and then they would come back in, but I wasn't sure how to get them back into the room they were in.
Hey, Dan, can we talk about that after we get finished since we have people coming back in?
Yep.
Thanks. Welcome back, everyone. We're bringing folks back in from the breakout rooms. Hopefully you found out something interesting about your community, the community of us here together with the learning community, and that you were able to share something about yourself or learn something about someone else that was interesting and helped us to remind us that we are all more connected than we think we are. So the next thing that we're going to do, and if you'd like to share an aha that you found out about yourself or someone else in the breakout rooms, please utilize the chat. Remember, the chat is a communication tool. So we'll be going through those. We'll be learning together with the chat, even as we move forward. Remember, we're centering your voices. I don't like to do facilitations or trainings where I'm the only one speaking. So feel free to come off mute, to come off your microphone. If you have something you'd like to add, if you have a question, populate the chat or ask me directly. And we definitely have space for that. And so as we go to our next slide, I wanted to share our community agreements with Alive and Well and the Cultural Competency Collective of Kansas City. And they're very simple. They are that we will explore and engage with one another. We will reflect and apply our learnings, and that we won't shame or blame anyone for anything that they feel or may express, and that we won't avoid or derail our learning. Oftentimes when we get uncomfortable, we like to distract ourselves from ways in which we might be learning something new or learning something that challenges us. And we're going to encourage us to sit with that feeling, to practice the breathing that we did when we came in, of centering ourselves, because that breath helps us when we're going through some of those processes. It also helps us to calm down or give ourselves joy when we need it. So these are our community agreements, and they're that simple. One of the things that we're going to be learning with one another today as we go to the next slide, our learning objectives objectives are, at the end of this session, we will be able to understand the connection between trauma-informed and restorative practices, understand the restorative practice hypothesis, define, identify, and implement restorative practices for personal and professional use, understand and implement, understand and implement. And if you can, remember to mute yourselves and mute your microphones. We will understand and implement the social discipline window and the restorative framework, along with the aspects of trauma-informed practices. And we will be able to practice restorative practice skill sets, such as restorative conversations. That's one of the reasons why we go into the breakout rooms, our way in being in community with one another in circles, and compassionate communication, and being able to identify basic local resources for restorative practices. And that's going to be alive and well. Okay, does anyone have any questions? If you do, please put it in the chat. NVC stands for Nonviolent Communication, Kim, also known as compassionate communication. Okay. So the core principles of Alive and Well, you all, in our Missouri model for trauma-informed care, our Missouri model for trauma-informed schools, and our Missouri model for trauma-informed health is equity. And so that's one of the reasons why we really wanted to explore what it means for us to be centering the work of diversity, inclusion, equity, and centering that in these core principles, because these are the core principles around which Alive and Well moves, right? So the core principle of collaboration, safety, empowerment, trustworthiness, and choice. And equity is at the center of that. And with that, when you're looking at one of our indicators for equity in both the Missouri model for trauma-informed schools and the Missouri model for trauma-informed care, as well as the Missouri model for trauma-informed health, our equity lens is applied to all programs and policies to address bias and the impact of historical trauma and systemic oppression. We recognize that we can't do that without race in the United States, in Missouri, in Kansas City, St. Louis, the Boot Heel, Southwest Missouri, Mid-Missouri, Northwest Missouri, or Northeast Missouri. We can't do that without centering that. It's one of the bases that we believe at Alive and Well. And so we give any organization or system or institution the stages of recognizing where they are along the trauma awareness cycle, right? Oftentimes people are pre-trauma aware, and there's nothing bad about that or wrong with that. It just means that they don't know yet. They don't know what it means to be looking through and utilizing the trauma lens. And so we give these stages to help organizations, systems, and institutions, as well as us as people, to recognize that this is a process. It is a gradient. It is not somewhere we arrive. It is not a destination. It's a way of life, and a way in which we then move through life by thinking about things from a trauma-informed space. So as we go to our next slide with the question trauma, I'd like for you all to put in the chat, what you believe trauma is. What do you believe trauma is? And I would love to hear someone come off mic and share what they believe that trauma is, or what they know trauma to be. Kim Giles says something awful that happens to someone. Yes. Anyone else? I'm a veteran teacher, you all, so I feel very comfortable with silence. I also feel very comfortable with volunteering people what to do. I don't want to though. So, and all voices are welcome. Who thinks they know what trauma is? An event that changes someone's life, Kimberly says. Experiences that are abrupt or painful or personal. A dramatic experience, Tracy says. Response to a life-changing event. Susan says defined by the individual.
Something deeply disturbing has happened to somebody.
Something deeply disturbing that's happened to somebody. Thank you, whoever that was that came off mic. I appreciate that.
Funny.
All right. So trauma is all of those things, and we're going to discuss that as we move forward. And we want to talk about what we're
Cecilia, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I was saying that trauma is all of those things that everyone said and more. And what we want to encourage everyone to do is that we're going to shift our lens to a trauma lens. And we want to ask ourselves, what stories do we tell ourselves to explain behavior? Think about that. What stories we tell ourselves to explain behavior? When we recognize that behavior oftentimes in our actions is nothing more than the way we communicate an unmet need, right? And so when folks behave in a manner that we don't quite understand, in a manner that seems not aligned with an action that just happened, oftentimes that is a trauma response. And so we want to share in the next slide, as we do, how we understand trauma and recognize that trauma can be a multitude of things. Trauma can be an event. It can be an actual experience of, or threat of physical or psychological harm, or the lack, withholding, control of material or relational resources crucial to health and development. It can be a single event or repeated events. What often takes people by surprise when they recognize the definition that we have of an event is that we understand the things about threat of physical or psychological, mental, emotional harm, but we don't think about it from the terms often of lack, withholding, or control of material or relational resources crucial to health and development. So when we think about things like how we have determinants of health now around zip codes, how we're recognizing that many people are going hungry in the times that we're in, how we're recognizing these types of things, have we thought about that many people that we know live in traumatic situations all the time, that they're experiencing trauma in ways that we don't even think about or understand? Now, another way that we look at trauma is through the experience. This is how someone assigns meaning to the event, which depends on the perception of the individual. So folks used to say, I remember I've heard the adage, one person's ton of bricks is another person's ton of feathers. And that is true. Some people can experience and are resilient when it comes to almost anything. And other people are more sensitive and more aware of what they are going through, even as they're going through it. And so experiential ways of experiencing trauma are very important and are defined by the individual. They cannot be defined by another person. And lastly, the effects of trauma, right? The effects of trauma results of the person's experience of the event. This can be neurological, it can be physical, it can be emotional, or it can be cognitive, and it can be a combination of all of those, okay? So we wanna really shift our lens to experiencing ourselves as well as others through the lens of trauma. Now we want to go to the next slide, which is going to give us the information about restorative practices, which falls under the bucket of trauma, right? If trauma is the lens in which we see things, restorative practices are the practices, tools, and skill sets that we can have in order to help us with the impact of trauma. And so Ted Watchell of the International Institute of Restorative Practices defines restorative practices as a social science that integrates and develops from a variety of disciplines and fields, including education, psychology, social work, criminology, sociology, community health, organizational development, and leadership. It's done so in order to build healthy communities, increase social capital, decrease crime and antisocial behavior, repair harm, and restore relationships. What we know is that because of these things, we center relationships so that we can be in community with one another. We can repair the harm that happens in all of our relationships and all of our communities, and we can restore and reconcile with one another. And so I imagine, what would our world be like? What would our cities and our towns be like if we move from a community perspective of restoration and reconciliation as opposed to authoritarian and punitive views? And so that's what restorative practices ask us to explore. In the next slide, which is the evolution of restorative justice, that's Howard Zerr that is in the picture there. He is really the grandfather of restorative justice and restorative practices in the United States. He shares with us that restorative practices has evolved from restorative justice, and it's a new field of study that has the potential to positively influence human behavior and strengthen civil society around the world. This is very important to me. This is very important to, I imagine, all of us on this call, right? Ways in which we can be with one another in a way that all are centered, all are valued, and all are in community with one another. And so this requires a paradigm shift. And as we go to the next slide, we recognize through restorative practices that there are different approaches. The traditional approach focuses on rules, it focuses on justice and guilt, it focuses on accountability and punishment, and it focuses on the offender, the person who did the harm, as opposed to centering the person that has been harmed and repairing those relationships. The restorative approach focuses on people and relationship. It focuses on justice as identifying the needs and the accountability of the community and the person who was harmed. It also shows that accountability is understanding the impact and repairing the harm. So it includes not only the person that's been hurt, but the person who has harmed as well. And it shows that all of us can have direct roles in this justice process. The community can be witness, we can be support, we can be encouragement, and we come to understand the need for amends and remorse. I think about this as an educator, what our schools would look like if we centered restorative approaches as community in the way we develop culture, as opposed to authoritarian rules-oriented approaches that we do now in our societies. And so as we go to the next slide, I want to share with us the fundamental hypothesis of restorative practice. It says that people are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes when those in positions of authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. And that is a quote and a definition and a hypothesis by Ted Watchell, who is the president of the International Institute of Restorative Practices. And so I'd like for you all to start populating the chat around what you're feeling as we're shifting, or as we're exploring what it would mean to shift the paradigm from an authoritarian, rules-oriented punishment society to a community, relationship, restorative, reconciled society. I know for me, that's pretty exciting. And so as we go to the next slide, I'd like to share with us the social discipline window of restorative practices that really helps us to understand why this works. So I know that most of us would probably think when we're looking at this and we ask ourselves, are we restorative or not? Most of us would like to say that in this quadrant, we're in the upper right-hand corner, right? That we're restorative, that we always are centering relationships and community, that we're always trying to find ways in which to reconcile with and repair harm. But the fact of the matter is that 99.9% of us fall in line with some of those other boxes, right? We're either two, which is that authoritarian punitive model. We're either neglectful, which means that we just remove ourselves from the situation. We don't focus on anything. We try to hide up under the covers as if nothing has happened. Or we're permissive, meaning that we kind of try to help everyone. Poor baby, I'll do this for you. Poor child, you know, you come from this community. Your community doesn't have any resources, so I have very low expectations for you and what you can do in school. And so I don't really think that you can do much, right? And so what restorative practices is asking us to do is recognize that we all have to make shifts in order to be with one another and to be restorative with one another. I can give myself as an example. My natural personality, probably, and my natural orientation is more to, so authoritarian, punitive, willful, than it is with. And so as a person who deeply believes in restorative practices and trauma-informed practices, when I feel myself getting uncomfortable, if things are being more process-oriented as opposed to product-oriented, I recognize it is me wanting to center in rules as opposed to relationship. It's me wanting to center in structure more so than relationship in the process of relationship. It is me wanting to center in hierarchy more so than the process of relationship, and that everyone has voice and that everyone has value. And that is one of the reasons why, as we try to shift the paradigm from traditional approaches to restorative approaches, it's so hard for us. It's more hard for us as adults, I will say, than it is for most students and for most young people who are more nimble and more flexible in that way. Okay? Does anyone have any questions? If you do, please feel free to put them in the chat. Please feel free to come off mic and share any ahas or things that you're thinking about this shift in this paradigm shift from traditional practices to restorative practices. Why do you think it's so challenging for us?
For me, it's everything that my daughter, who is 18, sees in the world, the possibilities, you know, that I, as a 50-year-old, say, oh, I used to feel that way too, but it's just not possible.
Right. Absolutely, Tracy. Thank you for that, right? It is being able to look through those lenses saying, this is what could be. Let us reimagine what could be as opposed to what is. Thanks, Tracy. Who else?
Sorry for joining in late.
That's okay. Hi, Wasim.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good.
I think the filters that we all have, that's the biggest challenge that I see, because I just started traveling and just came back from the Gambia, and it is quite alarming to see. I missed the China part, but it's quite alarming to see what's happening in Africa. But when you live in a society and you don't have exposure or accessibility, you don't question authority. You just do what is norm to you. But as a diaspora, when you go back home and you see the changes that one can make, but the system is designed to isolate you. And the minute you open your mouth, they say, oh, look at you, you're so westernized now. And that way I'm dismissed. I'm no longer an African. I'm a Westerner. My ways of thinking are different. So that's just a little bit what I had to say.
Thank you, Wasim. We appreciate your perspective and point of view. That's very interesting. It is. We tend to fall back to traditional default behaviors as opposed to doing what Tracy has talked about her 18-year-old wants us to do, which is explore how we can be in community with one another and explore what can be new. We have time for one more thought. Who would like to share?
I guess I would.
Thanks, Joanne.
Hi. Yeah, this is, people have been trying to do this within the capitalist system forever, like the Federation of Cooperatives movement, of trying to own your own business, manage it, and be the workers. So, you know, I like to build on the people who have come before us. And I really appreciate focusing on this.
Thanks, Joanne. I think Joanne brings in a good point. Everybody brought in good points. And thank you for those who put things in the chat as well. So please read what the minds in the chat of your community members and things that they're sharing. But this is something that we can reimagine. It is something that folks and systems are going to try to make us default back to a traditional approach. And as Joanne reminds us, it's not new, right? Restorative practices and trauma-informed practices comes out of indigenous culture. It comes out of tribal culture. It comes out of us being in community with one another. And there have been ongoing approaches for people trying to be more restorative forever, right? And so this gives me hope. It gives me hope of recognizing there are ways in which we can move with one another. Thanks for sharing, you all. And so as we go to the next slide, we have a way in which in our organizations and institutions that we can move with one another and start shifting from traditional practices. And one of those ways is by asking questions, is by asking restorative questions. Instead of saying, why did you do that, Joanne? What's wrong with you, Claudine? Or why would you do something like that, Wasim? We could say, what happened? What were you thinking about at the time? What have you thought about since? Who has been affected by what you've done? In what way have they been affected? And what do you think you need to do to make things right? And for those who have been harmed, we can say, what did you think when you realized what had happened? What impact has this incident had on you and others? What has been the hardest thing for you? And what do you think needs to happen to make things right? Imagine if we started moving from these types of approaches when we started teaching our children how to talk. Imagine what would happen in conversations about job performance or behavior. We centered restoration and reconciliation and each person and asked the question of, what's going on? What do you need? How can we help that to happen? We want you to be successful. What are the ways in which we can work in community to do so? What would happen in our communities, especially our communities, but not only our communities that are big cities in the state of Missouri, but our communities that are rural, our communities that are small towns and suburbs that are being racked with violence? What might happen if we ask these questions as opposed to starting the school to prison pipeline in grade 3? And so these are the questions that restorative practices helps us to ponder. Okay. And so this is what we're going to really base all of the shift and changes that we are going to discuss for the next 45 minutes with one another as we move through. Okay. All right. So here at Alive and Well, as we go to the next slide, we really encourage all of us to change the question, right? To shift the question to, we need to go back one more slide, Micah. Yep. Changing the question to become alive and well, we need to change the question from what's wrong with you, what's wrong with me, to what happened to us, right? That's using that trauma lens. And in order to do that, remember, in centering equity at Alive and Well, we recognize that race has to be one of those things in which we do that with. So as we go to the next slide, we want to ask each other, what is racism? We ask each other this question because we know that racism is kind of like how we were answering trauma. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So we recognize, as we're trying to answer that question, we need to have a formalized way and a formalized definition of that so that we can have a conversation that's meaningful and not just a conversation based on feelings and opinions, as opposed to a conversation that's based on the definition and fact. So as we're moving through to our next slide, again, we're centering equity, and racial equity is important in how we move through this. It's important in building trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, safety, and empowerment for all involved. As we go to the next slide, we have the definition of racism as race prejudice or racial prejudice, plus the misuse and abuse of systemic, institutional, and organizational power. Racial prejudice plus the misuse and or abuse of systemic, institutional, and organizational power. And I wonder if this is the definition of what most of us would have said racism is. Who'd like to share if that's what they thought about when they heard the word racism?
So again, just to jump in here, I like the way you introduced this. So in Africa, we have tribalism. Mm-hmm. Here you have racism, there we have tribalism.
Yes.
And one of the key components because I'm a certified diversity trainer, and one of my key components here is how can I have a discussion, not an argument?
Yes. Are you in Africa right now, Wasim?
I just came back and I'm about to go back again. I was there for 3 weeks.
Where are you now?
I'm in Kansas City right now.
You're in Kansas City? Okay, cool.
Yes. But so for me, the biggest thing was because when I was in the Gambia, and this is now where I really learned about slavery. And then there's the Mandingo, the Fula, and the Jalu. So the Mandingo happened to be the superior of all of them. And then some places I went and people were bowed, like they were bowing down to some people because they were from a different, and it took me a minute to understand what was going on here. And then they said, oh yeah, this is the Mandingo tribe. We have to like go down. So tribalism again exists, and that's another form of racism.
Yes. It's another form of colonialism, which racism comes out of. Yes, absolutely. So is this what we thought about when we saw the term racism? Or did we think about an individual person who did an individual act or called someone a nasty name or something like that? Do we think about systems, institutions, and organizations that move forward this racial prejudice, that misuse and abuse the power that they have in a racialized manner? At Alive and Well, we think that this is very important for us to consider as we're looking at equity, because if we're going to shift from being racist as a society, as organizations, as systems, institutions, as people, then we have to know the definition from which we're moving from, right? And we have to know that this is a systems issue. It is not only a people issue. And so with this in mind, we want to look at what is anti-racism as we go to the next slide. And we want to have the definition of that. So the definition of anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies and practices and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. It is also saying that anti-racism changes the values, structures, and behaviors that perpetuate systemic racism. So when thinking about that and thinking of the definition, we have a video that we'd like to show everyone and then have some discussion around. It's a short one.
So I have a question for you. Are you non or are you anti? Several months ago, in response to Ferguson, Baltimore, the killings of Freddie Gray and Tamir Rice, my friend Caitlin put up a Facebook post breaking down the difference between non-racism and anti-racism. Most of us are non-racist. Because racism is looked upon as some moral lapse, we feel quite self-assured by simply not being racist. I'm not a bigot. I don't sing that N-word when my favorite rap jam comes on. I didn't vote for that guy. I'm not burning any crosses. I'm not a skinhead. I don't, I won't, I'm not, I've never, I can't. What you end up with is an entire moral stance, an entire code for living your life and dealing with all the injustice in the world by not doing a damn thing. That's the great thing about none. You can pull it off by simply rolling over in your bed and going to sleep. So why are you sitting at home and watching things unfold on TV instead of doing something about it? Because you're a non-racist, not an anti-racist. Now do this for me. Take the C out of racist and replace it with a P. I'm not a rapist. I'm not friends with any rapist. I didn't buy that rapist last album. All these things that you're not doing. Meanwhile, people are still getting raped and black boys are being killed. It's not enough that you don't do these things. You're going to bed with a clear conscience is not going to stop college students from getting assaulted. You thinking climate change is terrible is not going to stop climate change. You being so assured that you're not anti-black, anti-Muslim won't stop the next hate crime. And it's wonderful that you recognize how brave gay people are when facing persecution, but they aren't the ones who need to be brave. We need to get active. We need to hold people accountable. We need to accept that what hurts one of us hurts all of us. And we need to stop thinking that injustice going on in the world isn't to an extent our fault. We need to stop being none and start being anti.
Racism.
Thank Michael. Thank you. So think about that quadrant, right? Think about the social discipline window. Remember, it was the 2 and the 4 axis, but remember there was also that not or that non. And I think that that's one of the things that keeps systemic, institutionalized, organizational oppression going, is that we think that because we are not for something, though, that we can just be non, as opposed to figuring out how to be with one another. And so Ibram X. Kendi says, he's the author of How to Be an Anti-Racist, in case you didn't know that already. I'm assuming that most people on this call probably do. He says the opposite of racist is not non-racist, it's anti-racist. What's the difference? One endorses either the idea of racial hierarchy as a racist or racial equality and equity as an anti-racist. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist, or locates the roots of problems in power and policies as an anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist, or confronts racial inequities, as an anti-racist. There is no in-between safe space of non-racists. I think we can do that with all oppression, right? We could do that with classism. Either we do the things to eliminate poverty, or either we don't. We can do this when it comes to sexual identity or gender identity. Either we believe that people should have equitable means and access to marriage, to healthcare, to being able to identify themselves as they so choose, or we don't. And I think this is the crutch of why we at Alive and Well think it's so very important for us to center equity, because then we are able to look at all of these things in which we are talking about, discussing, and moving forward, so that all people can have accessibility, so that all people can belong, so that all people can be operate from equity and inclusion, albeit of race or other ways in which we identify ourselves. So we want to provide some time for us to discuss this. And so we're going to go back into our breakout rooms for about 4 to 5 minutes. And then we're going to come back out and we're going to share ahas and discussions before we go into our second space of belonging and what it means to actually belong with one another in community, and why that's a restorative practice. Okay, so please join your breakout room. We'll see you in a few minutes. Wasim, did you have a breakout room before? Yeah, we got you one. Okay. Gail, Jamie, Janessa, and Michelle, do you all have breakout rooms? Michelle and Gail, were you given breakout rooms before? We want to make sure that you can talk with your community members, if you so choose.
It looks like Michelle would be in room 1.
Can we put her in room 1? Does Gail have a room?
Yeah,
Yes,
they have
room
5
3.
rooms, but there's no way to, put them there. Just assigned. I can reassign different rooms, but they should have the invite to go to their room.
Yeah, I see it up in my corner as well.
Cecilia, earlier, I didn't want to interrupt you, but somebody had asked if they will get the PowerPoints.
I don't know if we're doing that. Are we doing that, Micah?
The only thing I know is that we are uploading the video, the recorded training on the landing page, the CCC landing page on our website. So I don't know.
Yeah, I
if
don't think that
live-
we should. Yeah, I don't want to give out the PowerPoint.
And what I was saying earlier, Mike, is when I was doing a trauma awareness training, you know, internet connections get unstable. And sometimes when folks are in breakout rooms, they get kicked offline and then they come back. And I wasn't sure how to get them back into their breakout rooms when that happened. Cecilia, I'll message that person and let her know that the recording of the training will be on our website, but the PowerPoint won't go out.
Okay, thank you. Mike, if we can start bringing them back, that would be great.
On it.
We coming back?
Yeah,
So
we were almost breaking this whole thing into like a solution like that, and you just took us off.
so we can share with one another. What did you come up with?
No,
And then-
I let my group share because I think it's only fair. I was late, and it's for me to yield my time to others.
Thank you, Wasim. That's a good restorative practice. Who would like to share what you were discussing in your breakout spaces? And remember, there's no right or wrong. We're exploring this with one another.
Okay, I'll go since nobody wants to go. We were talking about racism. And so I was quickly saying in a quick synopsis, I have lived longer in the United States than I've lived in Africa. And when this Black Lives Matter started, so I'm married to a Caucasian, and I have a friend that is he's Caucasian, but he's married to a Malaysian, and he didn't know that thing would affect him. And the question came when I wanted to write a letter, and he was like very hesitant. He's like, well, this really doesn't concern me. And all of a sudden, only to find out that his kids were on the streets protesting. And then all of a sudden we came to this conversation of, I asked him a question like, do you ever have a conversation with your child riding 4 deep? And that was a shock to him. He's like, what do you mean riding 4 deep? I'm like, well, when Black children, when Black parents have the children leave the home, we ask them not to be more than 4 or 5 kids in a car. There is a likelihood of you going to be pulled over. And this is a conversation that he's never had a conversation with his son, because his son is, of course, light-skinned. But I said, we have these conversations daily. And then I said, I've been pulled over 70 times, 70. And for what? I finally ended up taking the Citizen Academy class so I could get to know the officers. And they finally know me. And living 15 years in Lenexa, I know them by name now, and they would pull me over just because they could, you know. And I finally joined the class to understand what was going on. And I'll give you a little bit more about me. So not only am I a migrant, I'm Black and I'm Muslim. So September 11th actually changed my life. I looked at America in a different way, and I was a school teacher. I actually resigned. So this is a conversation that we were having in our group, and I forget her name. She was sharing something of the same.
Thank you, Wasim. What else came for other people up in your groups? Thank you for that.
One of the things that we kind of spoke about, and racism and kind of came up as part of our conversation, is the definitions are incredibly helpful in being able to define or understand placement. The non versus anti, and non kind of is non-committing. And, you know, with all of the distractions that we all kind of experience, it's a safe space, but you're not committed to anything when you're in a non-space, in that non-space. The other thing is, you know, we looked at what to do versus how to do, defining, you know, when we have events like the George Floyd incident and the uprising that occurred behind that, you know, and the rallying that everyone participated in. You know, we know what to do, but then when you ask the question, well, how do I really change and have an impact on the influences in the lives of those that I need to touch, as it relates to racism and all of its systemic challenges? How to do it is a very different conversation sometimes than what to do. A lot of times we can have what to do. This is what you need to do. You have to do this. You have to do this. You have to do this. But then how you do that really takes some thought behind it.
Thank you, James. Thank you for that.
I also think,
go ahead. No,
I also think it's quite important to challenge those microaggressions, just because, you know, if we're talking about how we can maybe figure out how we can have that conversation with that person, you know, we were talking in our group at least about how it can be quite challenging in the workplace, especially for our white allies, to kind of have those conversations and understand where we're coming from, but challenging those microaggressions so that they understand that what they're saying comes from a place of systemic racism and ignorance, and that we do need to break that down in order for them to understand. And not that we're labeling them as racist, but what they're saying, is a microaggression. And let's break it down so we can figure out where that stemmed from, right? And which we know, but we being able to kind of go through that and hopefully find common ground.
Thank you for that, Maria. Absolutely. So thank you all for feeling like this is a safe space and a brave space to be able to share of those things. Again, continue to populate the chat and share your ahas and share some of the things you learned. I want to move us on to thinking about inclusion, accessibility, and belonging. And so recognizing that at the center of equity and diversity is in moving to inclusion, moving to accessibility. So ensuring that every person has access to opportunity, access to good housing, access to affordable food, affordable healthcare, access to transportation, access to everything that they need in order to live their lives in a full manner. And belonging. What does it mean to actually be in community and collective with one another? And so again, if we're shifting this through a trauma lens, right? If we're shifting this through a trauma lens, if we're shifting this to restorative practices on things that we can do and skills that we have to build this and be center relationship and community, then we think it's really important that we move not just in diversity, but inclusion, accessibility, belonging, and really being able to do that through a racialized lens, the trauma lens, and a restorative lens. And so the great John Powell, if you don't know John Powell, please get to know John Powell. John Powell is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. He is internationally recognized in the areas of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. He says, when you strip people of their humanity, when you deny people their full participation, when you refuse to see the divine in people, that is called othering. Race is a very powerful way to other in the United States, but there are other forms of othering as well. Around the world, we other people because of religion, language, immigration status, sexual orientation. I would add gender identity. We are very creative in finding ways to say someone's not a part of the we. John Powell goes on to say that while othering processes marginalize people on the basis of perceived group differences, belonging confers the privileges of membership in a community, including the care and concern of other members. Belonging means more than just being. It means that we get to move past inclusion to belonging, which is the difference being that in belonging, you have the power to co-create the thing into which you belong. So when we think about systemic racism, when we think about systemic oppression, and we think about the lack of power marginalized groups have, do they have the actual ability to co-create the communities in which they live? Do they have the actual power? Do we have the actual power? Do I have the actual power as a Black woman, as a Latina woman, to create the world in which I want to live in? And so that is what moving from diversity and really moving into inclusion and belonging gives us. Finally, John Powell says, belonging or being fully human means more than having access. Belonging entails being respected at a basic level that includes the right to both co-create and make demands upon the societies in which we live. And so what we at Alive and Well believe in moving through a trauma-informed lens and moving with restorative practices and applying that lens, we believe that there are ways in which we all should be able to co-create our worlds, co-create our communities, and make demands on our communities, demands for justice, demands for democracy, and demands for inclusion and belonging. And so as we go to our slide that is centering how we apply this lens of trauma, we recognize that oftentimes we look at the fruit of the tree, right? We look at the things in which people present out. We look at the things in which people are going through, the trauma in which people are going through. So we look at domestic violence, we look at homelessness, incarceration, mental illness, divorce, physical and emotional neglect, maternal depression, sexual and emotional abuse, substance abuse, and domestic violence, as opposed to looking at the soil that provides the conditions for this fruit. It's easy to look up top and look at what people represent and what people share and how people behave. And yet we don't like to look in the roots of a capitalist racial society, the poverty, the discrimination, the community disruption, the lack of opportunity, economic mobility and social capital, poor housing, quality and affordability, and violence. And so at Alive and Well, we ask that we look at this whole picture so that we can have a better understanding when we're applying the lens of trauma, so that we can have a better understanding when we're figuring out how to be in relationship and community with one another. So we have another video that it can help us center why this is so important and why we at Alive and Well believe it's so important for us to move through and with. This is a short one again, so let's watch it together. Thanks, Micah. We can stop it there. So, again, when we go to the indicator for the Missouri Model for Trauma-Informed Care, and we look at equity and why we need to center equity and why we need to center race and historical trauma and the awareness of systemic trauma, that video kind of sums it up, huh? That video sums up this race that we've been in since 1640 something, and how that has been an non-equally weighted race. And so we want to give us some time to discuss that, and how this gives us a different lens on which we should look at things that might make us uncomfortable, that might make us feel a certain type of way, that might make us want to move more towards non than anti, which is not centering relationships in ourselves and community. So any thoughts that came up, any feelings around the video? What stuck out to you?
To me, there was nothing new. It's the same thing.
That's true for some of us.
Yes, it's the White Boys Club. I mean, sorry to say that out loud, but nothing's changed for us. I mean, we are seeing taking a few steps forward, but then 20 backwards. You know.
Yes.
So hey.
So I think another question, thank you for that, Wasim, is where do you feel challenged or uncomfortable about some of the things that we've been learning with one another today? And it's okay to feel that. It's actually quite normal to feel that.
I'd like to say a couple things. One is,
Sure,
I'd love to have the source of that video, because all my life I've been trying to educate certain people in my family about what's going on. And that really does it. It's so succinct. I think, I'd love to have the source of that video.
We just put it in the chat for you,
Oh,
Joanne.
thank you very much. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. I've been working on anti-racism for a long time. It's easier to do in Massachusetts. When I came back to Kansas City 6 years ago, after like 40 years of being away, I was like, wow, has anything changed? But then I saw the Urban Initiative and, our great Kansas City's great mayor, Quentin Lucas. And, there are things, but it's so, even some of the faith communities that are trying to do things like the largest Methodist church in the whole nation, the Church of the Resurrection, has an alliance with the Reverend Cleveland's Methodist Church.
St. James United Methodist.
Yeah, St. James United Methodist. But they never address economic development. I mean, they socialize with each other. Well, isn't that lovely? But that's addressing things on the non-racist level, not on the anti-racist, addressing the system level.
Yes.
I'm so frustrated with white people who think they're doing something when they're just running around in circles.
Thank you, Joanne. So Joanne shared a challenge and shared some things. Who else would like to share?
The uncomfortable feeling, it's not necessarily about what's shared or discussed. It's exhaustion and it's anger and it's trauma. Racism, you asked the question in the beginning, what is racism? My initial response is it's trauma. And so that's the uncomfortable feeling for me, is anger and frustration and tiredness, like exhaustion.
Absolutely. The extra added burdens of those things and what that means, right? Walking around in that, which is trauma. Thank you for that, Sheila.
I think that video was more powerful than any narrative I've seen. And it actually made me feel kind of sad toward the end. But I also think when you talk about privilege, people have to recognize privilege. If your whole life has been that way, that is just your norm. That's not privilege to you. That's been your life. So there's a learning curve there. We're talking about non-racist and anti-racist. We want to get from non-racist to anti-racist, but that's going to be a process also.
Absolutely.
Even recognizing that you have racism and implicit biases is making some progress.
Thank you, Arnetta. We have time for one more.
Yeah, I just wanted to just share. So it's interesting. I had two thoughts on it. One, I think that, the video is absolutely true. And I think it is a very present reality. I do think that there have been some things that have occurred to combat some of it. However, I do not feel at times that there is a full disclosure of we want to help, we want to share, we want to break down the walls, but to what end? Is there a side story? Is there an ulterior motive to doing some of those things? When you look at community housing and things like that, yeah, we want to build the houses in the community, but then, is it really available and accessible to those that are in the community as opposed to those that are being moved out? The other thing is sometimes when the hand of assistance is given from others, there's this air of suspicion that sometimes I feel, and it's maybe personal to me, that you go, are they really wanting to help, or what else is going on? Is there some, again, ulterior motive that is in the wings that 2 months later you'll find out the gotcha, or at the end of the project, yep, we assisted, we helped to write these challenging laws, and something else got slipped in that didn't really move us forward, but actually moved us backwards.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. So we want to discuss in our last 5 minutes or so, next steps. Thank you all for sharing and for putting things in the chat and moving forward in perspective. And so the things that we want to think about in next steps are
You're muted.
Thank you. That is, I thought it was just 2021. It's also 2022. That is the phrase, you are muted. Thank you for that, you all. And so as we move through next steps, one of the things that we want to ask is, what are the ways we can become trauma-informed as organizations, as systems, as institutions, as people? And what we can do as programs, organizations, or systems is realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand the potential paths to recovery. Right? We recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients and families and staff and within ourselves, right? Because we're in these systems. And we respond by fully integrating the knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. That's what James was just talking about. That if we come from a trauma perspective, then those of us who are used to some things might then say, well, I can trust this, or I might be willing to move forward with this and not be suspicious, or not wonder what is the agenda, or be able to address what might the agenda be. And trauma-informed organizations, systems, and institutions and people, we seek to actively resist re-traumatization. That's kind of what Sheila was talking about, the ongoing way in which we move forward in society, and we're re-traumatizing people all the time and don't realize it. Racism is trauma. And so how are we re-traumatizing people? By stopping someone 70 times on a highway or on a street? How are we in a car for simply driving while Black? Okay. And so we want to do this with the restorative practice of building trust, by being with one another, by centering relationship, by focusing on community. And so how does with build trust? Remember, that all of us are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes when those in positions of authority do things with us rather than to us or for us. And so what we're doing is we're asking everyone to shift the question, to utilize the restorative practice of shifting the question to not what's wrong with us, not why did we do something, but what's wrong, what happened to us. So we then can look through our world through a trauma-informed lens. We then can utilize the restorative practices of mindfulness, of breathing, of yoga, of being in community with one another, being in relationship with one another. And we then can create systems of belonging where we can co-create the worlds in which we want to live. And so we thank you for being with us at Alive and Well Communities today. We thank you for exploring all of these things. One of the things I would like you to do in our last minute of being with one another is that we populate the chat with an aha that we had today from this facilitation, and a one-word feeling word of how we're feeling as we move this out into the world with our next steps. So Michael or Dan will play some music for us as we're leaning out, and we want to thank you for being here. This video will be on the Alive and Well social media space, so on Facebook. So feel free to watch it again. Feel free to utilize the resources that were within the video or within our facilitation. And we look forward to seeing you with our next learning community in May. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And so we will be focusing on mental health and how we all can move forward in ways that are trauma informed. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for being here.